"Ma'am, you need to leave the chamber immediately." The words sliced through the crowded City Hall auditorium so sharply that even the reporters near the back lowered their cameras for a second. Evelyn Brooks slowly turned her head toward the police officer standing beside her row. His navy uniform looked stiff beneath the bright ceiling lights. One hand resting near the radio clipped to his shoulder while the other pointed toward the exit doors. Around them, the massive chamber buzzed with low conversations, rustling paperwork, and the distant clicking of keyboards from journalists lining the press tables. But little by little, the room began to quiet. People noticed the black woman standing alone near the center aisle. Evelyn tightened her grip around the thick folder pressed against her chest. The edges of the papers inside were worn soft, like she had carried them for weeks. Her charcoal coat still carried tiny droplets of rain from outside, and the fluorescent lights reflected faintly across her silver reading glasses. "I have a right to be here," she said calmly. Her voice wasn't loud. That was what made several people stop talking. Officer Grant Walker exhaled slowly, already sounding irritated. "This hearing is restricted to approved speakers only." A few men seated near the council platform exchanged glances. One of them smirked behind his coffee cup. Another leaned toward the microphone in front of him and whispered something that made the woman beside him chuckle under her breath. Evelyn noticed it all. She noticed the expensive watches resting against polished wood desks, the tailored gray suits, the little gold city pins on their lapels. She noticed how nobody looked at her face for very long. They looked at the old coat, the weathered handbag, the tiredness beneath her eyes. Then they decided exactly who she was. Outside the tall windows behind the council stage, rain slid slowly down the glass overlooking downtown Baltimore. Red brake lights stretched across the wet streets below like glowing ribbons. Inside the chamber, the heat from television lamps made the air feel heavy. Officer Walker stepped slightly closer. "Ma'am," he said again, quieter this time, "don't make this difficult." Evelyn looked down at the folder in her hands. On the top page sat photographs of apartment buildings marked for demolition. Hundreds of families lived there. Elderly veterans, single mothers, disabled residents. People who had no idea the signatures approving the redevelopment project had been forged weeks earlier. She had spent 6 months gathering proof while most of the city ignored her emails, rejected her calls, or redirected her to voicemail boxes that were always full. Tonight had been her last chance. Across the chamber, Councilman Peter Vaughn adjusted his microphone and smiled politely at the audience. His silver cufflinks flashed beneath the lights as he prepared to announce the final approval vote for the $480 million redevelopment contract. "This project," Vaughn declared proudly, "will move our city into the future." Applause scattered across the room. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Future. That word again. She had heard it 100 times already. Future meant luxury condos where low-income families once lived. Future meant coffee shops replacing churches that had stood for 50 years. Future meant people like her disappearing quietly, while richer people arrived smiling with investment portfolios. Officer Walker gently reached toward her elbow. "Please," he said firmly now. "Let's go." Several cameras turned toward them. A reporter near the front row lifted her phone, sensing something uncomfortable unfolding. Evelyn could feel eyes settling onto her from every direction now. Some curious, some annoyed, some already judging her before she spoke a single word. Then Councilman Vaughn glanced toward her section and frowned. "Is there a problem back there?" he asked. Walker answered quickly. "Just handling a disruption, sir." A few soft laughs spread through the chamber. Evelyn inhaled slowly. The air smelled faintly of rainwater, expensive cologne, and old paper. Her heartbeat thudded steadily beneath the silence building around her. Then, before Officer Walker could guide her toward the exit, Evelyn lifted the thick folder high enough for everyone to see and said 5 words that froze the entire chamber cold. Those approval signatures were forged. For one long second, nobody moved. The chamber sat frozen beneath the white glare of fluorescent lights while Evelyn Brooks remained standing in the center aisle with the folder raised against her chest. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows behind the council platform, and somewhere near the back row, a camera shutter clicked twice before stopping completely. Councilman Peter Vaughn slowly leaned back in his leather chair. The smile he had worn moments earlier disappeared, so carefully it almost looked rehearsed. "Excuse me?" he asked. Evelyn lowered the folder just enough to meet his eyes. The approval signatures for the South Harbor redevelopment project were forged, she repeated calmly. Her voice echoed through the chamber speakers because one of the floor microphones had accidentally picked up her words. Suddenly, every cough, every rustle of paper, every whisper in the room disappeared. Officer Grant Walker tightened his jaw beside her. "Ma'am, this is not the place for accusations." Evelyn looked at him quietly. Spent 6 months trying every other place. A murmur rolled through the audience seating like distant thunder. Reporters exchanged looks. One woman from Channel 7 leaned forward so quickly her chair scraped against the tile floor. Vaughn adjusted the knot of his blue tie and forced out a laugh that sounded too polished to be natural. "This hearing is about economic revitalization," he announced to the room. "Not conspiracy theories." A few council members nodded immediately, eager to follow his lead, but others looked uncertain now. Evelyn slowly opened the folder in her hands. Inside were copies of permits, inspection records, financial transfers, and photographs. Some pages were highlighted with yellow marker. Others carried handwritten notes along the margins. Every sheet looked touched 100 times already. 3 signatures on the housing clearance approvals belonged to officials who retired 2 years ago, Evelyn said. One of them passed away last winter. Silence swallowed the chamber again. Vaughn's fingers stopped moving. Officer Walker glanced sideways toward the council table for direction, but nobody spoke. Evelyn continued before anyone could interrupt her. The residents living in those buildings received eviction notices based on paperwork that should never have existed. Her voice remained steady, but exhaustion sat beneath every word. The kind of exhaustion that came from being ignored too many times. Across the room, a woman seated near the public hearing section slowly covered her mouth with her hand. Older man in a maintenance uniform frowned down at the papers in front of him as if trying to understand what was happening. Councilman Vaughn cleared his throat sharply. "Officer," he said coldly, "remove her now." Walker hesitated this time. Only for half a second, but Evelyn noticed it. Everyone did. "Sir," Walker replied carefully, "if she has evidence, maybe we should let legal review it first." The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Her eyes moved slowly across the chamber. "My mother still lives there. Ms. Alvarez from Building 8 still lives there. Mr. Jenkins still lives there with oxygen tanks beside his bed. You call this revitalization because none of you have to watch those families pack their lives into cardboard boxes." Nobody answered her. The overhead lights hummed faintly above the chamber, while rainwater continued crawling down the windows overlooking downtown. Then Evelyn reached into the folder again and removed a single photograph. She held it high enough for the front rows to see. The image showed Councilman Vaughn standing beside 2 real estate executives at a private dinner inside a waterfront hotel less than 2 weeks before the redevelopment contract was approved. "You approved a project already promised to private investors," Evelyn said. A pulse flickered visibly near Vaughn's temple now. "That photograph proves nothing," he snapped. "No," Evelyn answered softly. "Bank transfers do." Several reporters instantly reached for their phones. The entire atmosphere inside the chamber shifted at once. It no longer felt like a routine city hearing. It felt like something dangerous had finally stepped into the light. The chamber exploded into whispers so quickly it sounded like wind rushing through dry leaves. Reporters leaned over tables. Council aides hurried between rows clutching phones, and somewhere near the side entrance a television producer barked into a headset for the live feed to stay rolling. Evelyn Brooks stood perfectly still in the middle of it all, the thick folder resting against her chest like armor. Councilman Peter Vaughn no longer looked confident. The smooth political smile that had carried him through press conferences and ribbon cuttings was fading beneath the harsh overhead lights. Tiny beads of sweat had begun forming near his hairline despite the cold air circulating through the chamber vents. "This hearing will come to order," Vaughn snapped suddenly, striking the wooden gavel harder than necessary. The sharp crack echoed off the marble walls. "Security will remove anyone interfering with city proceedings." But the authority in his voice no longer landed the same way. Too many people were staring at Evelyn now. Too many cameras were pointed in her direction. Officer Grant Walker shifted beside her, uncertainty pulling at his expression. He had dealt with protesters before. Angry residents. Disruptive citizens. But this felt different. Evelyn was not yelling. She was not emotional. She stood there calm enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. Across the chamber, a reporter from the Baltimore Chronicle raised her voice above the noise. Councilman Vaughn, are you denying knowledge of those bank transfers? Vaughn immediately pointed toward the press section. This hearing is not a criminal investigation. Not yet, Evelyn said quietly. The room went still again. Her words hung in the air beneath the fluorescent lights, while rain continued sliding down the tall windows overlooking downtown. Officer Walker looked at her more carefully now. He noticed the exhaustion around her eyes, the slight tremble in her fingers from standing tense too long, the coffee stain near the corner of one document where she had probably worked late into another sleepless night. Nothing about her looked reckless. She looked prepared. Vaughn opened a bottle of water with visible irritation. Do you honestly expect this room to believe you walked in here alone with accusations against elected officials? Evelyn slowly turned toward him. I walked in here because nobody else was willing to. The words landed heavily across the chamber. Several council members avoided eye contact completely now. One older woman near the back lowered her head into her hands. Another official quietly closed his folder, as if suddenly afraid to be connected to any of it. Evelyn carefully removed another document from the stack. $16 million was transferred through shell companies tied to Harbor Horizon Development. She laid the paper on a nearby desk where cameras could zoom in. 3 days later, those same companies donated to re-election campaigns supporting this project. Vaughn's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. This is absurd. But even his anger sounded thinner now, less certain. The giant digital screen mounted behind the council stage still displayed smiling architectural renderings of the future South Harbor district. Glass towers, rooftop gardens, luxury apartments facing the water. Beautiful images designed to sell progress. Evelyn stared at those pictures for a long moment before speaking again. You know what I see? She asked softly. Nobody answered. I see Ms. Alvarez losing the apartment she has lived in for 32 years. I see Mr. Jenkins carrying oxygen tanks down 6 flights of stairs because the elevators stopped getting repaired months ago. I see families pretending not to panic while rent prices rise faster than paychecks. Her voice never cracked. That somehow made it worse. More real. A silence spread slowly across the chamber now, heavier than before. Not confusion anymore. Recognition. Officer Walker swallowed hard. The room no longer viewed Evelyn as a disruption. She had become something far more dangerous. A witness nobody could easily dismiss. Then suddenly, one of the side doors near the council platform opened. Every head in the chamber turned at once as polished dress shoes stepped across the marble floor. And the moment Councilman Vaughn saw who had entered, the color drained completely from his face. The entire chamber watched in complete silence as Mayor Charles Holloway stepped through the side entrance beneath the glowing exit sign. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his black overcoat, and his expression looked nothing like the polished smile usually printed across campaign posters and television interviews. 2 aides hurried behind him carrying folders and tablets, but neither spoke. The sound of his shoes crossing the marble floor echoed through the chamber one slow step at a time. Councilman Peter Vaughn straightened immediately. Mr. Mayor, he said too quickly, forcing confidence back into his voice. We are dealing with an unexpected disruption. Holloway did not answer him. His eyes moved directly toward Evelyn Brooks, standing beside Officer Grant Walker near the center aisle. For a brief moment, the mayor simply stared at her. Something unreadable passed across his face. Recognition, shock, maybe even guilt. The room felt smaller suddenly, tighter. Even the reporters stopped typing. Evelyn remained still beneath the harsh ceiling lights, the thick folder pressed quietly against her chest. Her coat sleeves were damp from the rain outside, and tiny curls of gray threaded through the edges of her dark hair. She looked tired, but she did not look afraid. Officer Walker stepped back half a pace without realizing he had done it. Mayor Holloway finally spoke. Take your hands off her. His voice was calm, but it carried across the chamber like a blade sliding across glass. Walker released Evelyn's arm immediately. Nobody moved after that. Vaughn blinked several times before forcing out a strained smile. Sir, this woman interrupted an official proceeding with accusations that have not been verified. Holloway slowly removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. I know exactly who she is. A ripple of confusion spread across the room. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly toward the floor, almost as if she had hoped this moment would never happen. Holloway stepped closer until he stood only a few feet away from her. The overhead lights reflected softly against the polished marble beneath them. 20 years ago, the mayor said quietly, "My daughter stopped breathing during a school field trip at Harbor Park." Several people in the chamber exchanged puzzled looks. Holloway continued without taking his eyes off Evelyn. Paramedics were delayed because of an accident on Interstate 95. Everyone panicked. His voice tightened slightly now. Everyone except her. He nodded toward Evelyn. "She kept my little girl alive until help arrived." Complete silence swallowed the chamber again. A reporter near the front slowly lowered her camera. Vaughn's face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Holloway exhaled carefully before continuing. "The city gave me awards for leadership after that year. Newspapers called me a devoted father." He looked around the chamber slowly. "But nobody ever learned the name of the woman who actually saved my daughter." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably as dozens of eyes settled onto her all at once. She had spent most of the evening being treated like she did not belong inside the building. Now the room looked at her differently, and somehow that seemed to make her even more uncomfortable. Holloway's expression hardened as he turned toward the council platform. And tonight, several people in this chamber attempted to remove her before hearing a single word she had to say. Nobody answered him. Not one council member. Not Officer Walker. Not Vaughn. The mayor then looked back at Evelyn again. His next words landed harder than anything spoken all night. "Ms. Brooks is not here as a protester." He paused. "She is the lead federal ethics auditor assigned to investigate the South Harbor redevelopment project." The chamber erupted instantly. Reporters shot to their feet. Questions flew across the room. Phones appeared everywhere at once. One council aide nearly dropped an entire stack of papers rushing backward from the table. Peter Vaughn staggered slightly against his chair, his confident posture collapsing in real time beneath the cameras now pointed directly at him. But through all the noise, Evelyn remained completely still. Her eyes moved slowly across the chamber filled with people who had dismissed her only minutes earlier. Then she opened the folder one final time and quietly placed a sealed federal warrant onto the council desk in front of Peter Vaughn. The sealed federal warrant rested on the polished council desk like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Nobody in the chamber spoke for several long seconds. The overhead lights hummed softly above rows of stunned faces, while rain continued streaking the tall windows overlooking downtown Baltimore. Councilman Peter Vaughn stared down at the document without touching it. The color had drained completely from his face now, leaving his expensive smile looking brittle beneath the television lights. Around the chamber, reporters fired questions all at once. "Councilman Vaughn, did you know about the investigation? How long has the federal office been involved? Are arrests expected tonight?" Only 20 minutes earlier, he had been ready to escort Evelyn out of the building in front of everyone. Now he could barely look at her directly. Vaughn finally found his voice. "This is political theater," he snapped, though the confidence behind his words had nearly vanished. "A coordinated attempt to sabotage a city project that would create thousands of jobs." Evelyn looked toward him calmly. "Then you should have no problem explaining the offshore accounts." Another wave of whispers spread instantly through the chamber. Vaughn's hand tightened against the edge of the desk. "You cannot walk into City Hall making accusations and expect this city to collapse around you." Evelyn's eyes did not leave his. "The city is not collapsing," she said quietly. "Only the lies are." The words settled heavily into the room. Several council aides stopped typing altogether. One elderly janitor standing near the back wall slowly removed his cap, staring at Evelyn with quiet disbelief. The giant digital renderings of luxury towers still glowed behind the council stage, bright blue glass buildings promising a future most people in South Harbor would never afford to live inside. Evelyn glanced at the images for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you know what I found while reviewing relocation reports?" she asked softly. Nobody answered her. A 78-year-old woman was approved for temporary housing nearly 40 miles outside the city because there were no affordable units left nearby. Her voice remained calm, but the pain beneath it had become impossible to ignore now. "She has dialysis treatments 3 times a week." Several people lowered their eyes. Even some reporters stopped moving. Evelyn continued slowly. "A veteran with severe lung disease received an eviction notice signed by a housing official who died last December." Silence swallowed the chamber again. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly against the wet marble floors while distant thunder rolled somewhere outside above the harbor. Mayor Holloway rubbed a hand across his mouth, visibly shaken. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "Long enough to understand why people kept disappearing from meetings whenever I asked questions." Vaughn suddenly stood up, so fast his chair slammed backward against the floor. "This hearing is over." But nobody moved anymore. Not the reporters. Not the council members. Not even Officer Walker. Vaughn looked around the chamber desperately, realizing for the first time that he no longer controlled the room. Evelyn slowly closed the folder in her hands. The soft sound of paper sliding together seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "For 6 months," she said quietly, "people treated me like I was invisible." Her eyes drifted briefly toward Officer Walker, then across the rows of officials who had laughed when security approached her earlier that night. Sometimes that is exactly why the truth survives long enough to be seen. Nobody had an answer for that. Then suddenly, from somewhere near the back rows, a single pair of hands began clapping softly. The sound echoed once through the chamber. Then another person joined. Then another. Not loud. Not triumphant. Just steady. Human. And as the applause slowly spread across the room, Peter Vaughn stood frozen beneath the bright council lights while the future he had carefully built began collapsing in complete silence around him. The applause faded slowly into a strange, fragile silence that seemed to settle over the entire chamber like dust after a storm. Nobody knew what to say anymore. The giant digital screen behind the council platform still displayed smiling families walking beneath imaginary glass towers, but now the images looked hollow beneath the fluorescent lights. Evelyn Brooks stood near the center aisle holding the closed folder against her chest, while rain continued tracing slow lines down the windows overlooking downtown Baltimore. Her shoulders sagged slightly for the first time all night. Not from fear. From exhaustion. Months of carrying documents through empty hallways. Months of unanswered emails, canceled meetings, and doors politely closed in her face. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving only weariness behind her eyes. Around the chamber, reporters lowered their cameras one by one. Even the journalists seemed quieter now, as if the room itself demanded it. Mayor Charles Holloway remained beside the council platform, staring down at the federal warrant still resting on the polished wood desk. The overhead lights reflected faintly against the gold city seal beneath his hands. He looked older suddenly. The kind of older that did not come from years, but from realization. Officer Grant Walker stood near the aisle with his hands folded tightly in front of him. He kept replaying the last 30 minutes inside his head. The moment he reached for Evelyn's arm. The assumptions he made before she ever spoke. The way people in the room had laughed softly when security approached her. He had worked City Hall security for almost 9 years. He always believed he could read people quickly. Tonight, that certainty felt painfully fragile. Across the chamber, several residents from South Harbor still sat quietly in the public hearing section. An elderly woman clutched a tissue in trembling fingers. A young father held his sleeping daughter against his shoulder while staring toward Evelyn with wet eyes. They were not looking at her like a government investigator anymore. They were looking at someone who had refused to disappear when it would have been easier to stay silent. Evelyn slowly walked toward one of the tall windows near the side wall. The heels of her shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. Outside, downtown traffic crawled through sheets of rain, red taillights glowing against the wet streets below. She placed one hand lightly against the cold glass and closed her eyes for a brief second. Somewhere far below the building, a police siren echoed through the city before fading into the distance. Holloway approached carefully, stopping several feet behind her. "I should have listened sooner," he said quietly. Evelyn kept her eyes on the rain outside. "A lot of people should have." There was no anger in her voice. Somehow that hurt more. Holloway lowered his head slightly. "When my daughter survived that day at Harbor Park, I promised myself I would spend the rest of my career helping people." His voice sounded distant now, almost ashamed. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing who was being pushed aside." Evelyn finally turned toward him. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across her silver glasses. "Power does not disappear all at once," she said quietly. "It leaves one compromise at a time." The mayor looked at her in silence after that. Around them, the chamber remained almost completely still. No shouting now. No applause. Just the soft hum of lights overhead and rain against glass. Officer Walker slowly stepped forward, then stopped again, uncertain. His polished badge caught the light as he swallowed hard. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly. Evelyn looked toward him. He struggled for the words longer than expected. "I am sorry." The apology sounded small inside the massive chamber, but genuine. Evelyn studied him for a moment before nodding once. Not dramatic. Not forgiving everything instantly. Just acknowledging that he meant it. Walker lowered his eyes briefly, relief and shame crossing his face at the same time. Then somewhere near the back rows, one of the South Harbor residents stood slowly to their feet. Then another, and another. Not cheering, not celebrating, just standing quietly in respect for the woman who had carried the truth into a room full of people who never expected her to survive long enough to speak it aloud. The silence inside the chamber broke slowly beneath the distant rumble of thunder rolling across Baltimore Harbor. Rain continued tapping against the towering windows while dozens of people remained standing in quiet respect toward Evelyn Brooks near the side wall. The atmosphere no longer felt like a political hearing. It felt like a reckoning nobody in the room had prepared for. Councilman Peter Vaughn sat frozen behind the polished desk, staring blankly at the federal warrant resting inches from his hands. His expensive suit suddenly looked too tight around his shoulders. The confidence that once filled his posture had vanished completely, replaced by the hollow stillness of a man realizing control had slipped beyond his reach. Across the chamber, reporters whispered urgently into phones while television producers rushed updates to live broadcasts already spreading across the city. Somewhere downtown, people were probably watching the hearing from apartments, restaurants, buses, and hospital waiting rooms, watching the truth unfold in real time. Mayor Charles Holloway slowly turned toward the council platform again. The overhead lights reflected against the city seal behind him, while rainwater darkened the cuffs of his overcoat. "Effective immediately," he said firmly. "All redevelopment approvals connected to the South Harbor project are suspended pending federal review." Gasps spread across the chamber. One council member nearly dropped his tablet onto the floor. Another buried his face into trembling hands. Vaughn stood abruptly. "You cannot do this based on allegations alone." Holloway's expression hardened. "The federal government already did." The room fell silent once more. Evelyn watched quietly from near the windows, her tired eyes moving across the chamber, filled with people suddenly terrified of their own decisions. She had seen this moment before in smaller ways. The exact second powerful people realized accountability had finally entered the room. Vaughn pointed toward her with shaking fingers. "Plan this." Evelyn's face remained calm. "No," she answered softly. "I documented it." The words hit harder than shouting. Vaughn looked around desperately for support, but nobody rushed to defend him now. The alliances built through private dinners, campaign donations, and closed-door meetings were collapsing beneath the weight of public exposure. Officer Grant Walker shifted uneasily near the aisle. He watched Vaughn carefully now, noticing details he had ignored earlier in the night. The nervous twitch in the councilman's jaw, the sweat gathering near his collar despite the cold air. The fear. Walker realized something uncomfortable then. For years he believed authority always looked polished and controlled. Tonight authority looked fragile. Human. Cornered. Evelyn slowly stepped away from the window and approached the council platform again. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. Nobody interrupted her this time. Nobody questioned whether she belonged in the room. The same people who had dismissed her an hour earlier now moved aside automatically as she passed. She placed another thin folder onto the desk beside the federal warrant. "These are relocation denial reports from residents over 65 years old," she explained quietly. "Most were never reviewed." Holloway opened the folder slowly. His face tightened with every page he turned. Handwritten appeals. Medical hardship requests. Photographs of damaged apartments ignored for months while developers waited for residents to leave voluntarily. One letter from an elderly widow simply read, "I do not know where else to go." The mayor closed the folder carefully as if it carried something fragile inside. Around the chamber, several reporters stopped recording and simply listened. The room had become painfully human now. No slogans. No polished speeches. Just consequences. Evelyn looked toward the rows of South Harbor residents still standing quietly in the back. People think corruption only steals money, she said softly. But first it steals dignity. The words settled deeply into the chamber. Even Officer Walker lowered his eyes. Vaughn opened his mouth again, but no words came out this time. His reflection stared back at him faintly through the dark window glass behind the council stage, smaller than before somehow. Holloway exhaled heavily before turning toward city security near the entrance. Councilman Peter Vaughn's access to all redevelopment files is revoked effective immediately. The room froze again. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of power inside the chamber shifted completely. And for the first time all night, Evelyn Brooks no longer looked like the woman standing alone. The chamber remained suspended in stunned silence after Mayor Holloway revoked Peter Vaughn's access to every redevelopment file connected to South Harbor. Rain battered the tall windows harder now, streaking silver across the glass while the city lights below blurred into soft reflections against the wet streets. Reporters stood frozen with microphones lowered. Council aides whispered anxiously into phones near the side exits. Somewhere outside the chamber, distant thunder rolled across the harbor like a warning finally arriving too late. Peter Vaughn slowly looked around the room that had once moved at the sound of his voice. Nobody rushed to defend him anymore. Not the council members who once laughed at his jokes during fundraisers. Not the developers who promised campaign money over expensive dinners. Not even the assistants standing behind his chair. Fear had a way of making loyalty disappear quickly. Vaughn loosened his tie with trembling fingers. "You are making a mistake," he muttered weakly toward Holloway. The mayor did not answer immediately. He looked tired now. Not politically tired. Human tired. The kind that settles into a person after realizing how much damage silence can create. Evelyn Brooks remained standing quietly near the center aisle, holding the worn folder against her coat. The fluorescent lights above reflected faintly against her silver glasses, while residents from South Harbor continued watching her from the back rows. Some of them looked emotional. Others simply looked relieved, like people finally hearing someone speak aloud what they had lived through for years. Holloway slowly walked toward the council platform and turned off the giant presentation screen displaying the luxury waterfront project. The glowing images disappeared instantly, leaving only darkness behind the podium. Somehow the room felt more honest without the fake skyline shining over everyone's heads. "This city failed people," Holloway said quietly. "No microphones. No campaign voice. Just truth." His words drifted through the chamber beneath the soft hum of ceiling lights. "And I allowed myself to believe progress mattered more than listening." Several council members lowered their eyes. One woman quietly wiped tears from beneath her glasses. Evelyn studied the mayor silently for a moment before finally speaking. "Then listen now." Holloway looked toward her carefully. Evelyn stepped forward slowly, her shoes echoing against the marble floor. "South Harbor does not need saving," she said softly. "It needs respect." Nobody interrupted her. Not a single whisper moved through the chamber now. People there built lives long before investors discovered waterfront views were profitable. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. Teachers live there. Veterans live there. Nurses. Grandparents. Families who worked 30 years just to keep one apartment through rising rent and broken elevators. Officer Grant Walker listened from near the aisle with his head lowered slightly. Earlier that evening, he saw Evelyn as someone out of place. Now he realized she understood the city better than most people elected to lead it. Holloway exhaled deeply before nodding once. "You are right." The admission landed heavily across the room because powerful people almost never said those words aloud. Vaughn laughed bitterly under his breath. "So this is it?" he asked quietly. "Everything destroyed because one investigator walked into City Hall." Evelyn turned toward him slowly. "No," she answered softly. "Everything changed because people finally stopped ignoring what was already broken." Vaughn looked away after that. For the first time all night, he had no response left. The chamber sat wrapped in silence again while rainwater crawled down the windows overlooking downtown Baltimore. Unexpectedly, Officer Walker stepped forward. His polished shoes clicked softly against the floor before he stopped beside Evelyn. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "those residents outside the building are asking if they can come in. Elderly tenants. Workers still wearing rain-soaked uniforms after late shifts. Quiet people standing in the storm waiting to see whether truth inside the building would actually matter by morning." Evelyn looked toward the doors for a long moment while thunder rolled softly over the harbor again. Then she tightened her grip around the worn folder against her chest and whispered words that nobody in the chamber would ever forget. Open the doors. Officer Grant Walker pushed open the heavy front doors of City Hall, and the sound of rain immediately drifted into the chamber like a cold breath from the city outside. Dozens of South Harbor residents stood beneath umbrellas and streetlights on the wet stone steps. Some wore hospital scrubs after overnight shifts. Some still carried grocery bags. Others stood wrapped in worn jackets against the wind coming off the harbor. Elderly tenants, young families, construction workers, people who had spent years feeling invisible to the very building now glowing before them. For a moment, nobody moved. The chamber and the crowd outside simply looked at one another through sheets of rain and golden lobby light. Then Evelyn Brooks stepped forward slowly. The folder in her hands no longer looked like evidence alone. It looked heavy with every story people had trusted her to carry into that room. A little girl standing beside her grandmother near the entrance stared up at Evelyn with wide eyes. "Is it over?" she asked softly. The question settled into the chamber with painful honesty. Evelyn looked around at the council desks, the dark presentation screens, the reporters still standing speechless beneath fluorescent lights. Then she looked back toward the child. "No," she answered gently. "But now people are finally listening." The little girl nodded slowly, as if that alone mattered more than anything else. Residents began entering the chamber carefully, water dripping from coats onto the marble floors. Nobody rushed. Nobody shouted. They walked through the room with quiet dignity, looking at the same officials who once discussed their homes like numbers on spreadsheets. Some residents recognized Evelyn immediately and touched her arm softly while passing by. Others simply nodded with grateful eyes. Mayor Charles Holloway remained near the council platform, watching everything unfold in silence. The rain outside reflected across the polished floor beneath him, while distant thunder rolled farther out over the harbor. Officer Walker stood near the entrance, holding the door open for residents one by one. An elderly man using a cane paused beside him before entering. Walker instinctively offered support, but the man smiled faintly and shook his head. "I got it," he said quietly. Walker nodded back with unexpected emotion tightening his chest. Tonight had changed something inside him too. Across the chamber, Peter Vaughn sat alone beneath the harsh council lights while people filled the room around him. Nobody looked at him with admiration anymore. Nobody leaned close for political favors or whispered reassurances. For the first time in years, he looked exactly like what he was. A man sitting alone with the consequences of his choices. Evelyn slowly approached the council platform one final time. The chamber grew quiet again almost immediately. Rain continued sliding down the windows behind her, while city traffic glowed far below through the storm. She rested the worn folder gently against the desk and looked across the room, filled with residents from South Harbor. "For years," she said softly, "people called this neighborhood broken." Her voice carried naturally through the silent chamber. But broken things do not raise children. They do not take care of elderly parents. They do not work double shifts and still bring food to a sick neighbor. Several residents lowered their heads quietly. One woman near the back wiped tears from her cheeks. Evelyn continued carefully. The people were never the problem. Complete silence followed those words. Not the uncomfortable silence from earlier that night. This silence felt different. Honest. Holloway slowly removed the city pin from his suit jacket and placed it on the council desk beside the federal warrant. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "we begin again." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment before nodding once. Outside, the storm had finally begun to ease. The rain softened against the windows. Somewhere downtown, church bells echoed faintly through the wet night air. One by one, reporters lowered their cameras. Nobody wanted to break the moment. Evelyn turned toward the open doors of City Hall, where cool night air drifted inside, carrying the scent of rain and pavement. She walked slowly down the marble aisle between residents, now standing quietly on both sides of her path. No applause, no speeches, just people stepping aside with respect as she passed. Officer Walker held the door open as Evelyn reached the entrance. She paused briefly beneath the warm glow of the lobby lights and looked out across the rain-soaked city beyond the steps. The city looked different now somehow. Not cleaner, not fixed, just awake. Then Evelyn Brooks pulled her coat tighter against the cool harbor wind and disappeared quietly into the Baltimore night while the doors of City Hall remained open behind her.